If you're going to be afraid and wear it, what people are going to think, don't bother.
Cork sole, which will enable you to regain your rightful place.
Do you remember those outrageous 1970s fashion trends? So bold they're banned today? Back then, things like mesh shirts and neon flares turned sidewalks into runways, and everyone dressed to be seen. But if it was all about expression, why were we told to cover it up? You have not truly experienced the 1970s until you have watched a man sweat through a pale blue leisure suit made entirely of plastic. These shiny polyester uniforms were the official outfit of disco dads and smooth talkers alike. The material did not breathe. It clung, trapped heat like an oven, and squeaked when you moved too fast. Matching jacket and pants? Of course. Matching shirt with an open collar and gold chain? Required. You did not wear a leisure suit to blend in. You wore it to say, I am here, I am groovy, and I smell like synthetic fibers. Weddings, job interviews, late-night bowling, you wore it everywhere. Bonus points if it was beige, baby blue, or mustard yellow. Polyester was marketed as a miracle fabric, but it felt more like a punishment with a zipper. And yet, somehow, everyone looked proud, because looking sharp was more important than being comfortable. And comfort was a concept the 1970s politely ignored. Today, polyester leisure suits are mostly museum pieces or ironic Halloween costumes. But back then, they were the height of cool. The shinier the suit, the closer you were to John Travolta. And if you could survive a dance floor without bursting into flames, you were doing something right. Bell-bottoms in the 1970s were not pants. They were parachutes disguised as fashion. These flared monsters started out innocent enough, but by the end of the decade, they were so wide you needed a warning sign just to walk into a room. Some pairs were so exaggerated they swished when you walked and slapped the ankles of innocent bystanders. Denim, corduroy, velvet, you name it, it got the Bell treatment. Everyone wore them. Rock stars, school teachers, even dads at backyard barbecues. And the logic was always the same. The bigger the flare, the bolder the vibe. You would sit down, and the pants would spill over your shoes like a waterfall of fabric. Climbing stairs? Good luck? Running? Not unless you wanted to take flight. But bell-bottoms were a power move. They screamed independence, self-expression, and a little bit of disco arrogance. They made legs look longer, moves look smoother, and hallway turns look dramatic. Parents rolled their eyes, kids rolled their hems, and everyone tripped over something at least once. Eventually, the fashion world sobered up and quietly retired the super flares, but in their prime, bell-bottoms were walking, talking fashion statements with their own gravitational pull. You have to admire the confidence it took to wear a shirt that functioned more like a fishing net. Mesh shirts, especially on men, were the unofficial uniform of summer concerts, beach bonfires, and questionable nightclubs. They let your body breathe, sure, but they also let your chest hair do all the talking. Some were black and tight, some were bright and baggy, but they all had the same message. I am here to be seen. And seen you were. Every tan line, every tattoo, every questionable decision under that mesh got its moment in the spotlight. They were often paired with short shorts or bell-bottoms, creating a look that felt more superhero in disguise than actual streetwear. No one wore mesh to blend in. They wore it to reveal. And for some reason, no one thought twice about it. You could walk into a roller rink looking like a walking loofah and still be the coolest guy there. Today, mesh shirts are mostly reserved for bodybuilders, pop stars, or theme parties. But in the 1970s, they were for anyone brave enough to let a breeze do the heavy lifting. Honestly, it took guts, literally and figuratively, and whether it worked or not, everyone remembered the guy in the mesh. In the 1970s, men were walking around in shoes that could double as step stools. Platform shoes were not just tall, they were ridiculous. Some added 2 to 4 inches of height, and still, guys strutted like it was the most natural thing in the world. They came in wild colors, shiny materials, and even with goldfish in the soles. Yes, actual goldfish. This was not about blending in. This was about peacocking. Platform shoes turned a sidewalk into a runway and a dance floor into a balancing act. Disco was king and your shoes had to match the drama. Every guy wanted to look a little taller, a little flashier, and a lot more unforgettable. But the shoes were heavy. They clomped. They made stairs a nightmare and curbs a threat. Still, men wore them to dates, parties, and grocery stores like it was no big deal. You had to walk with swagger, because if you tripped, you were going down hard. Today, platform shoes for men are mostly punchlines or throwback costume pieces. But back then, they were legit fashion. And if you managed to dance through a Bee Gees song without falling on your face, you earned your place in history. There is a fine line between a V-neck and a wardrobe malfunction, and the 1970s jumped straight over it. Deep V-neck shirts for men were practically plunging. We are talking navel-level necklines. They revealed everything from chest hair to medallions, and sometimes just a little too much confidence. These shirts said, "I am sensitive, I am suave, and I do not believe in buttons." The fabric was usually clingy. The fit was tight. And the cut? So deep it made your aunt clutch her pearls. They were especially popular among disco lovers, lounge singers, and any guy with a six-pack, or at least the dream of one. Men wore them to parties, dates, or just casually around town like it was no big deal. Bonus points if you paired it with a leather jacket or a chain that caught every light in the room. Today, wearing one of these would probably get you asked to leave a PTA meeting, but in the 1970s it made you a trendsetter, a dangerous one. And while most shirts have mercifully inched their necklines back up, we still remember the era when showing your sternum was considered a power move. Nothing says rugged masculinity quite like a man exposing his midriff at the bowling alley. Male crop tops in the 1970s were more than just a fashion choice. They were a full-on rebellion against everything a shirt was supposed to do. These shirts stopped short, literally. They left your belly button out in the open like it had something important to say. Athletes wore them, rock stars wore them, and regular guys did too, usually with short shorts and a pair of long tube socks. It was a look, sometimes tight, sometimes loose, always confusing to older relatives. There were stripes, mesh, terry cloth, you name it. The logic was that it kept you cool while still letting the world know you had abs, or that you were just really, really confident. Today, male crop tops are rare, outside of themed parties or pop concerts. But in the 1970s, they were mainstream. They were bold, and they made you question everything you thought you knew about masculinity and fabric. It was fashion's strange way of saying, who needs full coverage when you have confidence? If you have ever looked directly into the sun, you might understand what it felt like to face someone wearing a lame disco shirt. These things sparkled like they were powered by electricity. Gold, silver, metallic green. If it could catch a disco ball's reflection, someone wore it. And they wore it proudly. Lame shirts were not about subtlety. They were about standing in the middle of the dance floor and demanding attention from every direction. You could hear them crinkle as the wearer moved, shimmering like a walking firework. Some had ruffles. Some had collars wider than dinner plates. All of them looked like they belonged in a costume shop. But they were very real, very mainstream fashion. Paired with tight pants and platforms, these shirts turned everyday guys into mirrorball demigods. You could blind someone on the dance floor if you spun just right. That was half the fun. Today, lame is mostly reserved for stage performers or drag queens. But in the 1970s, it was what you wore when you wanted to shine, literally and figuratively. Some collars in the 1970s were so large they probably needed their own seatbelt. These were not just fashion accents, they were full-on runway wings attached to your neck. Known as fly-away collars, they extended way past the shoulders and curved outward like you were about to take off. The shirts themselves were usually loud, floral prints, paisley, bold stripes, but it was the collars that did the talking. They peeked out from under leisure suit lapels like giant fabric tongues. You could not eat soup without dipping one in, but no one cared. The point was to be seen. These collars were dramatic, ridiculous, and somehow perfect for the era. You did not just wear them, you presented them. Often paired with gold chains or a splash of cologne, they made even the simplest outfit feel like a performance. And if your collar flapped in the breeze as you walked, that just meant you were doing it right. Today, collars like that are a relic of disco fashion. But in the 1970s, the motto was simple: bigger, bolder, better. And nothing said that louder than a collar that doubled as a parachute. Paisley was not a pattern. It was a full-blown personality in the 1970s. Shirts, pants, scarves, pajamas, even socks, everything was drowning in Paisley. The more tangled the design, the more fashion-forward you were. It looked like someone dumped a can of paint onto a lava lamp and called it a day, but that was the vibe. Psychedelic swirls, curvy teardrops, colors clashing like a family reunion. Paisley was everywhere. Men especially wore it with pride. Button-down shirts covered in Paisley made you look creative, sensitive, or at the very least, too cool to wear solids. Even suits got the Paisley treatment. You might walk into a party looking like the upholstery on a bohemian couch, but in the 1970s, that meant you were winning. Paisley was not subtle, and that was the point. It was emotional, expressive, almost hypnotic. And while it made laundry sorting a nightmare, no one wanted to be caught in anything less exciting. Today, Paisley lives on in neckties and vintage boutiques. But for one wild decade, it ruled the closet. If your pants did not match a traffic cone in the 1970s, were you even trying? Bright yellow, neon orange, fire engine red, men's pants came in colors so bold they could double as roadside safety gear. But back then, the louder the color, the cooler the confidence. These pants were not just bright, they were loud. Paired with patterned shirts or matching jackets, they turned every sidewalk into a fashion runway. Polyester made them extra shiny. Bell-bottoms made them extra dramatic. You would walk into a diner looking like a human highlighter and still get compliments. These were not just statement pants, they were conversation starters. Parents hated them, teachers gave up, and friends could not lose sight of you in a crowd if they tried. You could spot those colors from across a football field. Today, these colors are mostly reserved for construction workers and bold-fashion risk-takers. But in the 1970s, they were everyday wear, and you wore them like you were lit from the inside. There was no sneaking up on anyone in a pair of corduroy bell-bottom overalls. The second you moved, it was whoosh, 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 like a warning signal wrapped around your legs. These were the scratchiest, stiffest pants known to man, and yet they were everywhere. Made of thick corduroy that could double as insulation, they came in colors like burnt sienna, forest green, and mustard yellow. Overalls were already a bold move, but adding bell-bottom flares to the mix? That was next-level commitment. You walked into a room and took up audio space. Kids wore them. Teenagers wore them. Grown adults wore them to work, paired with turtlenecks or nothing at all underneath. The front pocket was too small to hold anything useful, but that did not matter. The real star was the swish. And while getting in and out of them required some serious planning, the reward was the full 70s silhouette, wide legs, fitted waist, and endless texture. Today, you might see them on a vintage runway or a retro-themed sitcom. But back then, corduroy bell-bottom overalls were the ultimate fashion flex. Loud, proud, and impossible to ignore. Imagine walking into a room wearing a suede vest covered in fringe, and absolutely nothing else on top. That was not a costume, it was an outfit. The 1970s had a special place in its heart for fringe, and it did not matter where you wore it. Music festivals, weddings, grocery stores, if your chest was out and your vest was swaying, you were golden. Inspired by westerns and hippie chic, fringe vests were part cowboy, part rock star, and completely unpredictable. The fringe moved with you, flapping like tassels on a parade float. And if you were extra bold, you added beads or patches. Bonus points if you had a feather earring to match. This was not about warmth, this was about energy. You strutted, you grooved, and your fringe followed like a loyal pet. Men in these vests looked like they had just come from a jam session or a spirit quest. No one questioned it. Today, showing up shirtless in suede might raise eyebrows. But in the 1970s, it raised your fashion status. Whether you were headed to a concert or just trying to impress someone at the laundromat, the shirtless fringe vest was loud, wild, and weirdly unforgettable. There was something strangely futuristic about zipping yourself into a full-body outfit with no escape plan. Men's one-piece jumpsuits in the 1970s were the ultimate blend of cool and completely inconvenient. You got style, swagger, and maybe a wedgie, all in one go. These things came in every color, often with matching belts, wide collars, and chest pockets that barely held anything useful. Some were sleek and shiny, ready for disco lights. Others were denim or velour, made for lounging like a king. The best part? You did not have to match anything. One zip and boom, you were dressed. But the worst part? One zip and suddenly using the bathroom was a full-blown event. You had to plan ahead. Still, men loved them. They made you look taller, smoother, and somehow in charge, even if you were just pumping gas. Celebrities wore them, mechanics wore them, even regular dads tried to pull it off on the weekends. Today, they are mostly seen in costume shops or ironic Instagram posts. But for a brief, glorious moment in the 70s, one-piece jumpsuits turned men into fashion astronauts, ready for liftoff, as long as they stayed hydrated very carefully. Wearing a velour tracksuit in neon yellow was basically saying, "I want to look like a couch, but louder." These plush, fuzzy outfits were everywhere in the 1970s, and they made squeaking fashionable. The texture felt soft, but sounded like you were wearing a beanbag chair every time you moved. Top and bottom matched perfectly. Electric blue, blinding red, radioactive green. These were not gym clothes. These were statements. You wore them to the grocery store, the record shop, or your living room and still looked like you were ready for a dance battle. They hugged your body in all the wrong places and left behind a trail of static electricity, but you strutted like royalty. Celebrities wore them. Your neighbor wore them. You probably wore one on picture day. Bonus points if you had white sneakers and a comb tucked in your back pocket. Today, velour tracksuits have made ironic comebacks, but they are no longer taken seriously. Back then, they were the definition of casual glam. You did not wear one to blend in. You wore one to shine, like a plush highlighter with attitude. Why settle for one kind of denim when you could wear 17 different kinds all at once? Patchwork denim jackets in the 1970s looked like someone took a pile of old jeans, ran out of scissors, and just started sewing. Mismatched shades of blue, weird pocket placements, and random bits of stitching made every jacket unique and a little chaotic. You could spot one from across a parking lot. They were boxy, oversized, and heavy enough to double as outerwear in a snowstorm. These jackets screamed, "do-it-yourself" energy, even if they came straight off a department store rack. Bonus points if you added your own patches, peace signs, band logos, or a big embroidered eagle for flair. Worn by everyone from hippies to rockers, patchwork jackets told the world you were creative, independent, and maybe a little disorganized. They were warm, they were rugged, and they were nearly impossible to wash without losing a button. Today, they are rare finds in thrift shops or custom-made for fashion rebels. But back then, they were everywhere. Denim on denim on denim. A wearable collage that said, "I love jeans so much, I made a quilt out of them and wore it to school." Who needed normal vision when you could live life through pink, yellow, or blue lenses? In the 1970s, color-tinted sunglasses were not just for blocking sunlight. They were fashion accessories that went everywhere. Indoors, at night, in class, at weddings, no moment was too inappropriate for tinted shades. Some people wore them with suits. Others wore them with mesh shirts. Either way, the vibe was, "I am mysterious and probably in a band." They made you look like you had secrets, even if you were just buying milk. The tint could be light enough to read through or dark enough to trip over furniture. Either way, you felt cooler instantly. If your eyes were visible, you were doing it wrong. The lenses were often oversized and came in oval, square, or totally unhinged shapes. You looked like you were seeing the world through a psychedelic filter. And maybe you were. Tints were not just aesthetic. People actually believed different colors enhanced mood, creativity, or vibes. Rose-colored glasses? Literally. It did not matter if it made reading impossible or turned a stoplight into a guessing game. You wore them because they looked cool. Today, tinted glasses still exist, but they are mostly reserved for celebrities or fashion daredevils. In the 1970s, they were as common as bell-bottoms and shag carpet. A little bit absurd, a little bit magical. And always a conversation starter, especially when someone said, "Wait, are those yellow indoors?" If you were a man in the 1970s and your shorts did not show thigh, you were doing it wrong. Short shorts ruled the decade. They were high-cut, tight-fitting, and unapologetically revealing. Paired with long white tube socks, often with colored stripes, they created the most iconic leg silhouette of the era. Whether you were mowing the lawn, jogging, or just grabbing a burger, your thighs were out and proud. And those socks? Pulled all the way up, no exceptions. It was not just fashion, it was leg day, every day. You could not sit down without making a statement, and you definitely could not bend over without planning your exit. Somehow, the more leg you showed, the more people thought you had your life together. The look was athletic, breezy, and maybe a little too confident. Coaches wore it, teenagers wore it, dads wore it while washing the station wagon. Sometimes with a crop top, sometimes with a mesh tank. It was all about freedom, of movement, of style, and of ignoring tan lines completely. Today, the combo lives on in gym class memories and retro photo albums, but back then it was normal, casual, expected. And yes, you had to adjust your shorts every 10 steps. But if your knees were the lowest thing showing, you were simply not 1970s enough. When a regular collar felt too boring and a tie felt too stuffy, the 1970s man reached for an ascot. Tied just so at the neck, the ascot gave off gentleman on a leisure cruise energy. But here's the thing, it was not reserved for tuxedos or formal dinners. You wore an ascot to brunch, to the movies, even roller skating. The ascot said, "Yes, I care about fashion. And yes, I am also here to disco." It gave the illusion of mystery, like you might have a yacht, or at least know someone who did. And if anyone asked what it was for, you just raised your eyebrows and said, "Style." People didn't question it because the ascot answered for you. They came in silky prints, paisley, stripes, floral, and were usually paired with V-neck shirts, open blazers, or leisure suits. It was elegance without effort, or at least that was the goal. The reality? It sometimes looked like your shirt was choking on a napkin, but still, the vibe worked. You were cultured. You were daring. You probably had jazz records and read poetry aloud once. Today, ascots are rare outside of costume dramas or red carpet risks. But for a little while in the 1970s, they were neckwear with swagger. A soft-spoken middle finger to traditional ties. And the best part? No knots required. There is denim, and then there is head-to-toe denim. The 1970s embraced the Canadian tuxedo like it was a lifestyle choice. Matching jean jacket and jeans, sometimes even with a denim shirt underneath, made you look like you were sponsored by Levi's. The washes did not need to match. In fact, the more chaotic the shades, the better. You could throw on patches, embroidery, or even rhinestones and still look like you belonged in a Marlboro ad. This look said, "I am ready to wrangle cattle or hit the roller rink, whichever comes first." It was the one outfit where you could spill anything and just call it more texture. The denim was stiff, heavy, and sounded like a tarp when you walked, but somehow you still felt cool. If your outfit did not creak when you sat down, it probably was not denim enough. Celebrities rocked it. So did kids, teens, and adults just trying to make it to the grocery store in one outfit. Double denim was tough, rebellious, and somehow stylish, even when it weighed 10 pounds. Today, it is considered a fashion gamble, but in the 1970s, it was a home run. You wore it with confidence and maybe a feathered mullet. You wore it until it faded, frayed, or got too tight to button. Denim on denim on denim, because moderation was not a thing in the 70s. There was a brief, brilliant time in the 1970s when suspenders stopped being functional and started being fabulous. Rainbow suspenders, made famous by Mork from Ork, were not just for keeping your pants up. They were a whole personality. Bright, stretchy, and worn outside the shirt, they became the ultimate "look at me" accessory. Kids wore them, adults wore them, even people with belts wore them, for extra flair. You could not wear rainbow suspenders and expect to blend in. They made you look fun, quirky, and maybe a little unhinged, in the best possible way. Paired with a smile and zero self-consciousness, they turned even the plainest outfit into a spectacle. If you wore them with confidence, people assumed you were either on television or destined for it. They were loud, cheerful, and just weird enough to feel futuristic, sometimes paired with overalls, sometimes with a full-on suit, and if you really wanted to commit, you added a propeller beanie on top. These suspenders were goofy, joyful, and totally unserious, which is exactly why people loved them. Today, they are mostly found in costume bins or comedy skits, but for one rainbow-streaked moment in the 1970s, suspenders were not about pants at all. They were about personality. There was a time when jackets were less about protection and more about performance. Nylon windbreakers in the 1970s did not whisper. They announced, loudly. Every step made a swish-swish noise that could be heard from the next block over. And if the sound did not give you away, the colors definitely would. Neon zebra, electric geometric patterns, fluorescent checkerboards. You did not wear these jackets. You entered in them. They were lightweight, shiny, and often just water-resistant enough to think about handling light rain. Mostly, they trapped sweat while convincing you it was active wear. But people loved them. You could toss one on over anything, jeans, jumpsuits, even swimsuits, and suddenly look like you were heading to jazzercise or a roller disco. Windbreakers often came with zippered pockets you never used, hoods that never fit, and elastic wrists that slowly cut off your circulation. Some even had matching pants, turning you into a full nylon machine. And when the wind actually hit, you puffed up like a nylon balloon. But none of that mattered. The real joy was in the prints. Wild, bold, and slightly unhinged. You could not blend into anything except a party invitation. Today, windbreakers have returned in sleeker forms, but those 1970s versions were pure chaos in color. You wore one to make a scene, and oh, you did. Feathered hair was not just a hairstyle, it was a lifestyle. In the 1970s, if your bangs were not swooping and your sides were not flaring out like eagle wings, you were behind the times. This look required commitment. Curling irons, blow dryers, layers, hairspray, and a secret pact with humidity to stay away. It was dramatic, voluminous, and oddly aerodynamic. Now pair that with a stretchy headband worn across the forehead, not over the top like a sweatband, but across the actual hair. The headband did nothing to hold anything in place. It had no purpose except to scream, "I am cool and I sweat fashion." Sometimes it was neon. Sometimes it was terry cloth. Sometimes it had glitter. Whatever it was just there, sitting like a crown over your poofed-out masterpiece. Feathered hair was for everyone. Guys, girls, movie stars, gym teachers. And the headband? That was just the exclamation point. You could not watch television without seeing someone rocking the combo. Farrah Fawcett made it legendary. Local teens made it a middle school rite of passage. If your hair moved in slow motion when you turned your head, you had done it right, and the headband bounced along, pretending to help. Today, the look is retro. Back then, it was daily wear. Nothing held your hair back, but you still had to try. Somewhere between a sweater and a throw blanket, the knit poncho took over 1970s fashion like a cozy invasion. It was one giant loop of yarn with a hole for your head and a mission to confuse everyone. You wore it over t-shirts, turtlenecks, even other sweaters, and still shivered. Because warmth was optional, style was not. Ponchos came in every color combination imaginable: rust and mustard, avocado green and brown, hot pink and navy. Some had fringe, some had stripes. Some looked like someone fell asleep mid-crochet and just kept going. They were big. They were boxy. They were the fashion equivalent of shrugging and saying, "This is fine." And yet, they were everywhere. Teens wore them to school. Moms wore them to the market. Hippies wore them with beads and boots. Even toddlers got in on the action. Little human burritos wrapped in yarn chaos. Matching was a myth. Functionality was a rumor. But confidence? That came with the territory. You threw one on and suddenly you looked artsy. Never mind that your arms were cold and the fabric caught on doorknobs. The poncho said, "I read poetry and know how to make herbal tea." Today, ponchos exist more for irony or boutique catalogs. But in the 1970s, they were a staple, a statement, a decision. One you wore over everything. Culottes were the fashion world's greatest prank. Are they shorts? Are they a skirt? Why do I feel so betrayed? In the 1970s, culottes were everywhere. They looked like flowy skirts from a distance, but take a step and surprise. You were wearing pants. Wide-legged, high-waisted, and full of fabric, culottes moved like a breeze and fit like a question. They were marketed as freedom, the elegance of a skirt, with the practicality of trousers. But in reality, they were just impractical enough to be interesting. You never knew how to sit in them. You could not quite run. And styling them felt like solving a puzzle your closet gave up on. Culottes came in denim, corduroy, floral print, and even plaid. Some had pleats, others had zippers in confusing places. You would pair them with a tucked-in blouse and maybe a vest, hoping it looked intentional. The result was part boho, part kindergarten teacher, and entirely 1970s. They were breezy but bulky, casual but complicated. Your grandma wore them. Your camp counselor wore them. And for a while, you probably wore them too, feeling oddly formal and vaguely frumpy at the same time. Today, culottes have tried to make comebacks under names like gauchos or wide-leg capris. But no matter what they are called, the confusion remains. There was a point in the 1970s where modesty took a coffee break and sheer blouses took center stage. We are talking see-through tops, worn with nothing but confidence, or at best, a suggestive bra underneath. These blouses came in soft chiffons, gauzy polyesters, and barely there silks. Light caught them like a disco ball. And when you walked into a room, so did everyone else. It was office attire in name only. Ruffled collars and billowy sleeves gave it just enough structure to call it professional. But the transparency? Pure Studio 54. The look said, "I own a typewriter and I get invited to rooftop parties." These blouses were usually tucked into high-waisted pants or pencil skirts, giving off a vibe that was equal parts secretary and nightclub singer. Patterns were bold, florals, stripes, and sometimes polka dots floating on ghost fabric. Some came with matching camisoles, but those got lost mysteriously. Jewelry was big, hair was bigger, and the confidence required? Off the charts. People wore them to work, on dates, to dinner with the in-laws, and no one flinched. It was bold, daring, liberated, and probably very distracting at morning meetings. Today, sheer blouses are layered and styled more carefully. But in the 1970s, sheer meant sheer, and fashion left very little to the imagination. MTV in the 1980s was not just a channel, it was a movement. The second you heard that iconic, "I want my MTV," you knew you were about to step into another world. A world where music lived on your screen, not just your speakers. Where your favorite artist could become a visual legend. It played music videos, actual music videos, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That meant you could go from watching Cyndi Lauper dancing through city streets to seeing Michael Jackson turn into a werewolf without ever leaving your couch. Music became cinematic. Performances became stories, seeing someone on TV who made you feel like you were not the only weirdo out there. And maybe, just maybe, being a weirdo was cool. MTV introduced you to bands you never heard of, genres you never explored, and visuals that burned into your brain like neon on wet pavement. You would tape videos, argue over countdowns, and swear that your favorite video was art. But when you got back to school, it was back to basics, and one look at your folder would say everything your mouth could not. Choppers in the 1970s were not just bikes, they were statements, and the louder and longer the fork, the bolder the message. You would see motorcycles with 6-foot extended forks cruising down the highway like something out of a comic book. These things had no front brakes, almost no suspension, and about as much handling control as a brick on roller skates. But nobody cared. They looked cool. And back then, looking cool was more important than stopping safely. Builders would chop down factory models, stretch out the frames, and slap on as much chrome as humanly possible. The longer it looked, the better. Riding one meant you had guts, or just no fear of potholes. Amazingly, these were all street legal. You could register a motorcycle with modifications that today would not make it past a parking lot inspection. There were no federal mandates on motorcycle geometry or braking systems. If it ran, it rode. Eventually, the law caught up, and these extreme builds got shut down by new regulations. But at the time, choppers were everywhere, from biker rallies to small-town roads, rolling art with no regard for physics. If you think that sounds wild, wait until you picture someone doing their weekly grocery run on a riding lawnmower. If you had a motorized toy watch in the 1980s, you were basically James Bond for about a day. These things were advertised as cutting-edge wearable tech for kids. They came with secret compartments, built-in games, tiny motors, and sometimes a mini flashlight that barely lit up a crayon box. It was like strapping a malfunctioning robot to your wrist. The appeal was instant. They looked cool, they blinked, they buzzed, but they rarely did any of it well. Most of the time, they stopped working after a couple of recesses. Batteries died fast, buttons got stuck, the motors jammed. And the plastic? Usually cracked if you smacked it against a desk. But for that brief window when it worked, you felt invincible. Until the alarm started going off randomly in class and your teacher confiscated it. Or worse, you opened the compartment only to find that whatever secret feature it had just did not. But still, you wore it proudly, because style always beat functionality in the 1980s. And nowhere was that more true than in the next trend. A fashion accessory that tried to blast your favorite jams but mostly just sat on your hip doing nothing at all. If your family took regular vacations to Disney World in the 1980s, you were not just lucky, you were wealthy. Plane tickets, hotel stays, park admission, overpriced snacks, and souvenirs added up fast. For most people, a trip to Disney was a once-in-a-lifetime dream. But for others, it was a tradition, a summer ritual, a brag, getting on that monorail, meeting Mickey Mouse, eating ice cream shaped like a cartoon head while fireworks exploded overhead. That was not just childhood joy, it was financial proof. It meant your parents had good jobs. It meant they got paid vacation days. It meant you had time and money to spare. Other kids spent their summer at home or at local parks. You came back with mouse ears, a sunburn, and stories. And the best part? The photos. You could always tell who had money by the family pictures on the fridge, especially if Cinderella's castle was in the background. Going to Disney meant more than just fun. It meant your parents believed in magic, and more importantly, they could afford to chase it. When did wonder become something only the wealthy could afford to remember? Pop-Tarts were the answer to a morning dream. Breakfast that popped out of the toaster, ready in minutes, no dishes required. When Kellogg's introduced them in 1964, they were a marvel of modern convenience. Frosted or unfrosted rectangles filled with fruit, or what tasted like fruit, wrapped in pastry, packed in foil, and ready to heat. They hit shelves just as the pace of American life was speeding up. Moms needed fast. Kids wanted sweet. Pop-Tarts delivered both. Whether it was strawberry, brown sugar cinnamon, or wild blueberry, every box felt like a little promise that mornings could be easier. Even cold, straight from the foil, they were a hit in lunch boxes and after-school snacks. No plate? No problem. The smell of a warm Pop-Tart coming out of the toaster was almost as good as the taste. Crispy edge, gooey middle, and just enough frosting to feel like a treat. By the end of the 1960s, Pop-Tarts had become more than a convenience food. They were a cultural touchstone, turning rushed mornings into something fun. And while they've changed flavors and designs over the years, those early Pop-Tarts hold a place in memory like few other foods do. Speak and Spell. A name so simple, you almost forget just how advanced it felt. This little orange learning machine had a robotic voice that felt both comforting and unsettling at the same time. The keys were rubbery. The screen was a small LED display, and the second it powered on, you felt like a kid genius. This was not just a toy, it was a computer. At least to us it was. And for a lot of people, it was the first time they ever heard a machine talk to them like a teacher would. It would ask you to spell elephant or photograph in that slow, mechanical voice. If you got it wrong, it would buzz like you had just activated some kind of self-destruct sequence. And if you nailed it, that same robotic voice gave you praise like it meant something, like it knew you. Speak and Spell was part game, part lesson, and 100% magic. You did not need Wi-Fi. You did not need batteries half the time. All you needed was the imagination to believe that this talking toy was the smartest machine in the house. And sometimes, it probably was. Of course, intelligence was one thing, but style? That was another story. If you were the kid with this next item, everyone knew you had your life together. If you were a kid in the 1970s and you did not have a gas-powered mini bike, were you even really living? These things were like pocket-sized motorcycles. No license required, no helmets expected, and no real supervision in sight. You would see kids as young as 10 zipping down sidewalks, through alleyways, and even across busy intersections, acting like they were in some kind of stunt show. The engines were loud, the brakes were questionable, and the safety gear was usually just a baseball cap. But nobody really cared. Parents would wave from the porch and tell them to be home by dinner. And the best part? These bikes were cheap enough that a few months of lawn mowing or paper routes could get you one. Police might stop and give a warning, but more often than not, they would just shrug and let you ride. It was pure chaos disguised as childhood freedom. Today, if you so much as start one of these in a neighborhood, someone is calling the authorities before you hit second gear. But back then, it was just how kids got around. Now imagine that same freedom, but with full-grown adults riding choppers that looked more like medieval jousting weapons than actual motorcycles. You knew it was going to be a good school year when your pencil case smelled like a fruit salad. Rubber-scented erasers shaped like food were the peak of academic excitement in the 1980s. They looked like tiny hamburgers, donuts, pickles, even sushi rolls. If you were lucky, your set came with a tiny tray and a fake soda. They were bright, colorful, and smelled like someone spilled a bottle of air freshener in an art supply store. Only problem? They did not actually erase anything. If anything, they left behind more streaks than they removed. Still, no one really used them. You displayed them. You traded them. You clutched them like they were gold. And every now and then, someone tried to eat one just to see what would happen. It was childhood logic at its finest. If it smells like a strawberry milkshake, it must taste like one too, right? Wrong. But what these erasers lacked in function, they made up for in flair. They were tiny scented trophies of your youth. And while they never helped you pass math, they sure looked good on your desk. Speaking of things that looked great on the surface but did not last, let us hit play on a sound that defined a decade and then disappeared overnight. The synthesizer, the drum machine, the shoulder pads. There was a time in the 1980s when denim did more than cover your legs. It told the world exactly how deep your family's pockets were. Jordache and Guess were not just brands, they were statements. Those perfectly tight-fitting jeans with gold-stitched trim and bold logos were the 80s version of a luxury badge. If you walked into school wearing a fresh pair, people looked. They stared. They whispered. Because not everyone could afford them. These were not hand-me-downs or department store basics. They were runway material for the hallways. You checked the mirror more often when you wore them, not to see yourself, but to admire what they meant. They hugged you in all the ways that made you feel like you mattered. They were not just jeans. They were confidence sewn into fabric. DoorDash ads showed glamorous models riding horses or stepping out of convertibles, and kids watched thinking, that could be me. Owning a pair was a fantasy made real if your parents were willing to fork over the money. It meant they cared about your status, your image, your place in the teenage pecking order. You wore them to the roller rink. You wore them to the mall. You wore them even when they were too tight because you knew what they meant. They meant you mattered. They meant you belonged. And if someone asked where you got them, you answered with pride. What happens to us when the name on our pants means more than the person inside them? Tang was not just a drink. It was an icon of American space-age optimism. Though developed in 1957, it exploded into fame in the 1960s when NASA used it during Project Mercury and Gemini missions. Suddenly, drinking Tang meant more than just orange-flavored powder. It meant drinking like an astronaut. Kids begged their parents for it. Commercials showed bright pictures on sunny breakfast tables with the promise of vitamins and space-fueled energy. It came in a foil pouch dissolved into water with a quick stir and tasted like the future. The orange flavor was tangy, a little artificial, but full of excitement. Parents loved it for the no-mess prep and long shelf life. Children loved it because it made them feel connected to the cosmos. No one cared that it was mostly sugar and flavoring. Tang had a mission patch of approval. It became a staple in American pantries, always ready for a quick mix on a busy morning. By the end of the decade, it had grown into more than a drink. It was a symbol, a bright orange badge of the space race, proudly poured into plastic cups across the country. And for many, one sip still tastes like childhood and liftoff. Made-for-television movies in the 1980s were not just filler. They were events. Whole nights were planned around them. When that promo would come on, this Sunday, only on ABC, you would perk up, lean in, and make mental notes to not miss it. This was before DVR, before pause buttons. You missed it? You missed it. These movies had titles like The Day After, V, The Final Battle, or The Ewok Adventure. Some were tearjerkers, some were thrillers, some were straight-up terrifying. And they had you glued to the screen, wondering how they managed to squeeze so much drama into 2 hours. Plus, commercials. Families would make popcorn, dim the lights, and treat it like it was an actual premiere. You watched it live together, and you talked about it the next day at school. Because chances were, everyone saw it too. They hit different. The music, the narration, even that grainy picture. It all added to the mood. You were not just watching. You were part of something. And right in the middle of those movies came the strange intermissions, ones that could go from innocent to haunting in 5 seconds flat. Get this, in the 1970s, there was no law stopping you from turning an old school bus into your family's home on wheels. You could snag a decommissioned bus for next to nothing, rip out the seats, toss in a mattress, a couple beanbags, and maybe a stovetop, and call it a camper. No certification, no inspections, no zoning permits, just pure imagination and the scent of diesel. Families would paint them wild colors, load them with mismatched furniture, and hit the road like modern pioneers. They did not have running water. Some barely had brakes. But they were mobile, cozy, and dirt cheap. There was something kind of magical about the idea. Taking your whole life, putting it on a bus, and driving until the road ran out. Today, you would need to pass a dozen inspections just to get halfway down the street. But in the 1970s, you did not need a license to be an adventure seeker on wheels. Now, if you thought turning a school bus into a camper was daring, wait until you hear about the three-wheeled wonders that are claimed to be safer than a sedan. There are hairstyles, and then there are structural engineering projects. Gravity-defying bangs, held aloft by industrial-strength hairspray, were the crown jewels of 1980s style. We are talking sky-high, shellacked to perfection, immovable bangs that could survive a hurricane. You did not just style your hair, you sculpted it. And the glue that held it all together? A can of Aquanet, the unofficial perfume of the decade. One spritz was never enough. You held that button down until the room filled with fog and your lungs begged for mercy. It was how you knew your bangs were officially done. They had to crunch when you tapped them. These bangs had volume, attitude, and possibly their own zip code. They required teasing, patience, and a total disregard for the ozone layer. Parents disapproved. Schools banned combs in lockers. But if your bangs did not touch the ceiling of your school photo backdrop, were you even living? It was extreme. It was ridiculous. And it was glorious. But eventually, the sky-high trend lost steam, and pastel blazers tried to take over the fashion throne. Spoiler alert, not everyone could pull off Crockett from Miami Vice. There was a certain kind of silence when someone rolled up their sleeve and revealed a Rolex or a Tag Heuer in the 1980s. Not because no one noticed, but because everyone did. That flicker of gold or the glint of polished stainless steel under the fluorescent lights was all it took. A high-end watch meant something back then. It meant precision. It meant power. It meant wealth. These were not the kind of watches you found in a department store carousel. These were the kind you inherited, the kind you insured, the kind you never took off, not even in the shower. You could hear the quiet respect when someone spotted it on your wrist. Teachers paused. Classmates glanced twice, and deep down, everyone knew. This was not just about telling time, it was about telling your story. And if you did take it off, it went in the original case, tucked inside a velvet drawer. A Rolex was not just a watch, it was a life achievement on your wrist. Tag Heuer had the sleek, racy vibe, the kind that made you feel like you should be in Monaco or racing through the hills of California. Owning one said you valued time, that every second mattered, that you were not just rich, you were exact. And in a world full of digital alarms and plastic straps, yours ticked. Literally. When did we stop wearing our success like a badge and start hiding it behind locked screens? Bugles arrived in 1966, and with them came a whole new shape of snacking. Shaped like tiny trumpets or cones, they were the snack you could eat or wear. Kids popped them onto their fingertips, wiggled their hands like claws, and then crunched them down one by one. But the novelty was not just in the shape. Bugles had a distinct texture, light, crispy, and a little flaky, that made them feel different from chips or pretzels. The corn-based flavor was salty, a little buttery, and oddly addictive. Unlike many snacks of the era, Bugles were not trying to copy something else. They were their own thing. Whether poured into a bowl for a party or packed into a lunchbox for recess, they brought a certain crunchy cheer to any setting. Parents liked that they were baked, not fried. Kids just liked that they were fun. Bugles became a staple of 1960s snack shelves alongside pretzel rods and Fritos, but they stood out for their playfulness. Even now, decades later, slipping a bugle onto your finger sparks a flash of childhood. They were silly, satisfying, and one of the few snacks that doubled as a costume. Taping songs off the radio was a sacred mission. You would sit for hours next to your boombox, finger hovering over the record button, praying that the next song would be the one. And when it was, you had one shot to catch it clean, no static, no interruptions, and above all, no DJ talking over the intro. But of course, they always did. The opening notes would hit, your heart would race, and just as you hit record, that was the latest from Madonna. Coming up next, we've got... And just like that, your perfect mixtape moment was ruined. You would yell at the radio like the DJ could hear you. Why? Why do you do this to me? It was a battle of timing and nerves. Some kids got sneaky and recorded during the night shift when the hosts were quieter. Others became masters of timing, predicting when the chorus would drop, when the ad break would hit. It took real skill. And even if you missed a few seconds of the intro, you still labeled the tape like it was gold. You were not just building a playlist, you were capturing a moment. Free music, sure, but earned through effort, patience, and pure willpower. And if you were serious about your song collection, you were not stopping at one track. You were building an entire soundscape, one emotional banger at a time. Yes, you read that right. Riding lawnmowers were not just for cutting grass, they were for visiting neighbors, hitting the local store, and sometimes even school drop-offs. In smaller towns, you could hop on your mower and putter right into town, past houses, dogs, and the occasional confused police officer. Nobody batted an eye. It was slow, it was loud, and it was very much not road safe, but it was legal. You did not need registration or a license, and in some places, people just threw a flag on the back and called it good. The lawnmower became an unlikely local legend. You might pass 3 of them parked at the general store like horses at a saloon. People waved like it was completely normal because, well, it was. It was practical and resourceful, and honestly, pretty charming. Today, cities and counties have all kinds of rules about non-standard vehicles on public roads. Most riding mowers now are strictly yard-bound unless you want a ticket and a lecture. But in the 1970s, nobody had time for that. If it moved and did not catch fire, it was transportation. Speaking of creative transportation, the next thing might blow your mind, because you could legally build a car in your garage from scratch and still register it for the road. Before padded gym floors and TikTok dance tutorials, there was the breakdancing board. It was exactly what it sounds like, a portable, foldable square of cardboard with a brick wall graphic or checkerboard print meant to simulate the streets. Because nothing says urban grit like unfolding a fake alleyway in your suburban driveway. These things were lightweight, glossy, and slid around on every surface. In theory, they let you spin, pop, and lock without bruising your spine on concrete. In reality, they slid out from under you mid-move, causing more scraped elbows than applause. But in the moment, they felt cool. They turned any parking lot into a stage. Throw on some Run DMC, slap that cardboard down, and suddenly you were in it. Never mind that it bent after 2 uses and warped in the rain. You were performing. You were part of something. Until the corner curled up or the board tore in half while trying to nail a backspin. But that was the 80s. Function took a backseat to flair. And speaking of flair, our next trend lets you turn every sweatshirt into a personal fashion statement or a wearable art disaster. Record players were more than machines. They were furniture, ritual, and mood setters all in one. In the 1960s, every home had one, whether it stood alone on a tabletop or was built into a cabinet the size of a small sofa. You lifted the lid, selected a vinyl record, and gently placed it on the turntable. Then came the careful lowering of the needle, a tiny, deliberate act that brought a whole room to life. The crackle before the music started was half the experience. Whether it was the Beatles, Patsy Cline, or the Four Tops, the sound filled the air in a way no radio could match. You listened to full albums, start to finish. You memorized the order of songs. You stared at the cover art like it held secrets. Records were delicate, and so was the act of playing them. Dust had to be brushed off. Needles had to be replaced. Some turntables had automatic arms, others had to be nudged by hand. Either way, it felt like ceremony. The music had weight, not just in sound, but in the effort it took to hear it. Families gathered for listening nights. Teenagers escaped into headphones. A stack of records leaning against the wall told you everything about someone. And even when the music skipped, it felt like part of the charm. That moment when the room fell still, waiting for the needle to find its groove again, it was quiet, real, and unforgettable. Today, vinyl has made a comeback, but for those who grew up spinning hits in the 1960s, it never really left. Owning a Trapper Keeper in the 1980s felt like owning a briefcase made just for kids, but with neon colors, Velcro, and personality. These were not just folders. These were statements. You did not just store your homework in a Trapper Keeper. You stored your identity. From bold geometric designs to wild illustrations of race cars, dolphins, or laser grids that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie, the outside of your Trapper Keeper said something about you. And that satisfying rip of the Velcro? That was music. It had pockets for pencils, slots for notes, compartments you never used but felt cooler just knowing they were there. There was something so absurdly organized about them that it made you want to turn your life into a schedule. You would write the dates on your notebook dividers, color code your subjects, and then forget all of it by Wednesday. But hey, the effort was there. You felt important carrying one around. It made you feel like you were growing up. And even if you never opened it for anything other than doodling weird cartoons during math class, it still felt like a win. But when it came to keeping track of things, there was one object that really made you feel like a collector. And not just of stuff, but of memories. You were not just writing letters in the 1980s. You were sending sensory experiences. Perfumed stationery sets were the peak of pen pal drama. Heart-shaped pages with lace borders, sparkly envelopes, and enough floral scent to knock out a small room. There were sets that smelled like roses, vanilla, ocean breeze, or something suspiciously like bubblegum and detergent. You would open a note from your best friend and nearly pass out from the aroma. It was like the page had bathed in perfume and never toweled off. They were beautiful, romantic, and borderline unreadable. The ink would smudge from the coated paper. The scent would linger for days. And if you tried mailing one of these in the heat, good luck. The envelope might as well have been dipped in cologne. Still, it was all part of the charm. These notes were not meant to last forever. They were moments frozen in scent. They smelled like crushes and sleepovers and secrets told in cursive. But not all nostalgia smells sweet. Because the next 1980s trend? It came with a can of hairspray, a comb, and enough height to qualify as a fire hazard. If any of these fashion crimes made you laugh, cringe, or remember your uncle's mesh shirt a little too clearly, drop your wildest 70s outfit in the comments, give this video a like, and subscribe so we can keep strutting down memory lane together.